Fighting continues in the Democratic Republic of Congo between local forces and Rwanda-backed M23 rebels. This despite ongoing peace talks. The M23 has taken control of much of the eastern part of the DRC since January, its first major advance being the capture of Goma in North Kivu province. It then went on to seize other important cities, including Bukavu, the country's second largest. Award-winning photojournalist Hugh Kinsella Cunningham has been documenting these takeovers as well as the aftermath, including the forced return of displaced civilians to their villages, burials of civilian victims, and the mass surrenders of the Congolese forces. Hugh joins me on set now to talk about this. Thank you very much for speaking with us on France 24.
Thank you.
Tell us first about the kinds of things that you saw while you were there in these last few months, and what struck you most about the situation.
There's a quite surreal element to this kind of conflict at the moment, because the last time M23 were active in 2012, they took over the city of Goma for just over a week, then swiftly withdrew. This time there's this kind of attempt to annex the Kivu provinces and sort of install governance. So it's a rebel group that wants to be seen as a political movement. You know, as you can see, you know, the soldiers are very well equipped. You know, quite a lot of this gear is given by the Rwandan army. But on the ground in Goma, there was heavy fighting. So the rebels came in. There was urban combat. In the city of Bukavu, it was a bit calmer. The Congolese army had retreated beforehand. But it was extremely traumatizing for civilians. You know, this front line has always been a very small, enclosed space. Over 3 years, the rebels have advanced and advanced and advanced, so civilians had nowhere left to run. So the fighting happens super close to civilian areas, and there were many casualties in the crossfire.
Of course. Well, let's take a look at one of your pictures in particular and look at that in more detail. This one was taken as M23 rebels seized the city of Bukavu, as you said. Tell us more about what is going on here and what we can see.
So this is a chaplain of the Congolese National Police, part of like a mass surrender to M23, like a very orchestrated, quite, you know, propaganda-heavy event. And the idea was that, you know, these surrendering police and soldiers will be taken for ideological training to join the group. So again, this is part of this push by the rebels to, you know, present as like a Congolese political movement that has widespread support. You know, this is also very interesting to sort of look at the equipment and the technology being used by the two sides. You know, you see the Congolese military and the police in kind of mismatched older uniforms, and you see the rebels with very modern gear. You know, you can hear drones overhead as well. So there's this kind of imbalance in the forces, and then, you know, straight away, you know, the M23 troops headed down to the border with Burundi as well. They kept seizing ground, and it was an extremely shocking turn of events, because again, over the course of the fighting, it's been in the field, like really remote bush villages. You know, it seemed so remote, and then over the course of just a month, they seized all this new territory.
And aside from capturing what it was like with the fighting sides, you also spent quite a lot of time with civilians. And it's worth noting, as you said, that there's been a huge civilian toll, millions displaced as well. This image that you're about to see on the screen shows civilians actually being forced out of a displacement camp and back to their villages. What more can you tell us about that? So
again, over the course of the fighting, as the rebels advanced, you know, there was artillery and mortars going back and forth. Civilians, you know, were forced to run to the city of Goma in these huge displacement camps on these volcanic rocks. You know, just families of 5, 6, you know, 10 children living in these tiny shelters. And when M23 seized Goma, you know, they said, well, the humanitarian crisis is over now. We've seized the area, so the civilians have 3 days to return home. And of course, many civilians didn't want to return home. Their villages have been used as military positions, but they had no choice. So they packed up their tents, they packed up their shelters, and they walked or, you know, took buses with all their possessions. And it was quite shocking, because, you know, I've photographed many displacements in the past of them running from gunfire. To see the same happening, but in reverse, was really shocking. And the first village I visited with civilians who were heading back home, you know, I found like RPG warheads, abandoned military equipment everywhere. So it's not a safe place for civilians to return to. And, you know, even as we were walking, a mortar shell went off, probably some unexploded ordnance from the fighting. And again, 1 month ago, I met some civilians in their village after this return home. And, you know, the infrastructure and everything has been so degraded. You know, people were laying out tarpaulins to catch rainwater for drinking water, because there's so few supplies.
And this conflict, it's very complex and it's been going on for decades, really. It's often referred to as the forgotten war. Is your work an attempt to tell the world, raise awareness more about this conflict, and why is it important to you if that's the case?
I hope so, and I think the thing with Congo, it's so easy to get lost in the acronyms of the rebel groups and everything, but there are so many traumatic things happening for civilians who are the main victims of all this. You know, one of the most interesting, smaller stories I did recently is I met some psychologists in South Kivu, and they're dealing with, you know, older ladies, their patients who, you know, these strange symptoms like hand tremors are coming back as the rebels are advancing, or, you know, dealing with these generational stories of conflict, you know, like families where like a lady may have lost her husband in a war 20 years ago when the AFDL rebels were advancing. And this time, you know, she's sheltering her daughter whose husband has also died in a similar context. So, you know, this trauma is passed down the generations, and there seems to be, you know, peace talks ongoing at the moment, mediated by Qatar and America, that seem to be showing some promise. But at the end of the day, you know, this conflict has, you know, affected about 2 million civilians who were displaced over the course of it, and, you know, 7 million people were displaced overall in Congo recently from various ongoing conflicts.
And meanwhile, there are other regions in East Congo that are experiencing different conflicts, which are all getting worse. Here, we're about to see another photograph that you took where we can see UN peacekeepers on patrol in Ituri province. How effective are these forces?
So I took this a while ago in a jungle area full of gold mines, a place called Kilo, and there was very heavy fighting between the army and Codeco militias, who have also displaced, you know, tens of thousands of civilians. In Ituri, peacekeeping forces are quite overstretched, and, you know, you have the Ugandan army has just deployed into East Congo as well. And the last time this happened, you know, there was a power struggle with Uganda and Rwanda on Congolese soil, and again, thousands of civilians fall victim to these things. In Goma and North Kivu, dealing with M23, it was quite clear that the United Nations was ineffective. You know, their stated aim was to protect towns like Goma and Sake. And eventually they stood down. A UN peacekeeping vehicle was destroyed, and the M23 forces did come in and they did engage the Congolese army. There were mass surrenders and, you know, so many civilian casualties. So I think it's fair to question at the moment what role the UN and peacekeepers actually play in these conflicts.
And just briefly to finish, what hope do civilians have for peace? I mean, you mentioned those peace talks that are ongoing. How is that being received on the ground?
Some sort of civilian peace activists I know, and I was working with over the last few years, you know, civilian voices are extremely absent from these peace talks, like local community groups, women's groups. If there is any representation, it's quite tokenistic. I think, you know, this conflict, it has this certain tragedy where when we look at any photograph of civilians, when we look at any family's story, you know, you can trace what happens to them just to a few political actors, and it's so tragic that the lives of so many are kind of influenced by decisions of so few.
Hugh Kinsella Cunningham, thank you very much for speaking to us on France 24.